Hello, and welcome to this panel discussion hosted by the IES as part of our Stages on the Road to COP26 work ahead of the COP26 UN Climate Conference in November. Today, we'll be looking at COP26 in the context of significant changes, which we'll need to see across our economic systems during the transition towards a net zero society. Inevitably, as we push for systemic changes which are transformative rather than atomistic, that's going to have an effect on businesses, jobs, and our economy as a whole. In this afternoon's event, we'll be talking about that transition, about what's already happening and how we can make the most of what businesses are already doing, how we can ensure jobs are protected and potentially enhanced during the climate transition, and how businesses, jobs, and the economy all tie together in the context of climate change. So that's our starting point, but I know that we'll have a chance to discuss a whole range of the interconnected issues associated with these topics. Tonight, we're joined by three excellent speakers representing diverse insights and perspectives across media, academia, and policy, all with crucial expertise across the subject area. Joining us today, first off, we have Sarah George from ed.net. Sarah's worked for ED full-time for more than 3 years, overseeing breaking news in the spheres of green policy and sustainable business, producing exclusive multimedia content, including high-level interviews, and latterly acting as secretary for ED's long-running Sustainable Business Covered podcast and new Net Zero Business podcast. In 2020, ED won the Association of Online Publishers Digital Editorial Team of the Year Award. ED covers all topics relating to sustainable business, giving Sarah a bird's eye view of trending focus areas. Sarah's also playing a key role in the delivery of ED's ongoing Countdown to COP26 festival of exclusive content and events. Secondly, we have Josh Emden from IPPR. Josh's work at the Institute for Public Policy Research, IPPR, focuses on developing just transition policy across all sectors of the economy. He is the program lead for the new social contract and industrial strategy themes for IPPR's Environmental Justice Commission. And Josh has previously worked on renewable electricity and heat policy, energy networks and systems, and implementation strategies that include devolved and local governance. He's a regular commentator on climate, energy, and just transition policy, and he's written on the subject for Huffington Post, Business Green, and Energy Monitor, amongst others. And our third and final speaker is Dmitry Zangelis. Dmitry is a special advisor to the Wealth Economy Project at the Bennett Institute, University of Cambridge, and is a senior visiting fellow at the LSE. He was until recently head of policy at the Grantham Research Institute at the LSE and acting chief economist for the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate. Previously, he headed the Stern Review team at the Office of Climate Change London and was a lead author on the Stern Review on the Economics of Climate Change, commissioned by the then Chancellor Gordon Brown. So we've got an excellent list of speakers today, and with that, we'll be able to start off with our presentations from those speakers. While the presentations are taking place, do remember that the Q&A function is open to your questions, and we'll be putting those directly to the speakers later on in the event. That said, we'll now hand over to the first of our speakers, Sarah George. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joseph, for such a kind introduction, and happy to be presenting today. And to kick things off, just because I know my other two speakers on the panel are emphasising some of the specifics of the business opportunity of the green transition of COP26, I'm going to be doing a brief explainer on how the sustainable business conversation has been changing and how businesses are preparing for and getting involved with COP26. Before we get into that, I mentioned it in my introduction, but a little bit more about ED, where I'm senior reporter full-time. So essentially, we are a digital-only B2B media brand, and our core audience is people working in-house in fields like sustainability, energy, resource management, CSR, ESG. Increasingly, there are carbon managers and net zero managers as well. So everything linked to that, and then increasingly, we're having readers from the C-suite as well. We're a small brand and we're Sussex based, and most of our readers are from the UK, and we write not only for the public sector but for the private sector as well. So that's businesses as well as organisations like local councils, NHS trusts and universities. While we're here to talk about the interconnections between the E, S and G, we do have primary focus on environmental issues in all that we do. As mentioned on the previous slide, ED's now been going for 21 years, which not only makes us older than Google, but it means that we've seen a lot of changes in the way that the sustainable business conversation is going. We'd probably be here all day if I was to outline everything in that timeline, but essentially back when ED was first set up, it was very much about CSR, and this was very much an add-on function at business. The focus tended to be on philanthropy, giving and volunteering rather than on science. But I've been at the ED team since April 2018, so I'm just going to briefly run through some of the biggest changes that we've seen since then. So if you can cast your mind back pre-pandemic to April 2018, it was less than a year after Blue Planet 2 aired, and the Blue Planet effect, as it was called, is in full swing. Consumers essentially wanted businesses to be plastic free and less plastic yesterday, and that was understandably therefore top of the agenda for many. There was a bit of confusion about what a good climate target looked like. There was climate science, but a lot has happened since 2018, and we were still seeing a lot of what I'd like to call a catchy climate target rather than a science-based one. So lots of businesses saying, for example, we'll cut emissions or emissions intensity by 30% by 2030, and you'd ask why, and you wouldn't really get much of a full answer. At this point, only 3 businesses had targets verified in line with 1.5C by the Science Based Targets Initiative, the SBTI, and that was Tesco's and Carlsberg and BT. There was this continued CSR focus that I've mentioned. A lot of our readers and editorial board and networking clubs mentioned that they felt a bit alone in all of this, a bit like they were an add-on, a bit like they were working in silos. And then also just looking back at the major policy change that has changed the conversation since then is net zero. So back in April 2018, the UK had not legislated for net zero by 2050. It was still working towards that 80% cut in emissions by 2050 under the original Climate Change Act, which left a bit of wiggle room. A lot of businesses thinking that they could somehow come into the 20%. Net zero was largely a theory rather than a policy, although it was coming up the agenda. So fast forward to now, and that's completely different. There are more than 700 businesses with 1.5C aligned science-based targets, and the SBTI is now moving to make 1.5C the minimum target setting requirement in the coming years. We've seen a lot of people saying that they feel less siloed and more involved, that their C-suite is coming to them now for answers rather than the other way around, and seeing a lot of hiring in this area as well. Also to note is the green recovery narrative has really been taking off, and I know that this will be talked about a lot by the other 2 speakers, but essentially in the wake of COVID-19, businesses are realising that sustainability is business critical, that biodiversity risk can very quickly become human health risks and public health risks, which can very quickly become major economic risks. We're seeing a lot more collaboration and a lot more engagement with policy, and these are some things that I'll come into in more depth on other slides. As I mentioned, one of the big drivers of these changes is the net zero legislation. So looking at research from Oxford University, they believe that more than 69% of GDP is now covered by net zero commitments from nations. So that's governments that have either set such legislation or signalled intent to do so publicly. And this really happened after a major IPCC report in 2018. It was the first major report looking at the real world differences between a 2-degree temperature pathway and a 1.5C temperature pathway, so the 2 Paris Agreement pathways. So it was pretty damning in terms of how much more we could avoid the worst impacts by keeping to 1.5C. It also essentially stated that the best chances of limiting to 1.5C involve halving net global emissions by 2030 and bringing them to zero by 2050. That's globally and at the latest. So this sparked this change in legislation at top line level, and we're starting to see related legislation coming through to back that up. So for example, in the UK, the 2030 ban on new petrol and diesel car sales, the retrofit wave in the EU, lots of stuff on energy from the Biden administration and so on and so forth. And at the same time, there's just been increased public awareness and scrutiny. And when I put this, I don't just mean consumers for businesses. This will be their own teams and their own C-suite members as well, and especially their own investors. So I can come on to some of the investor coalitions that are expanding and launching ahead of COP26 shortly. The IPCC built on that 2018 report last month with a look at the likely physical impacts of climate change. I'm sure most of us listening today will have seen the headlines on this. It's been called Code Red for Humanity by the UN as well. And as my last driver of change here, I've put COVID-19. I obviously don't want to say that this has been a good thing in any way, shape or form. However, as I've mentioned, it has changed the conversation and kickstarted that green recovery narrative. So we're seeing a lot more collaboration, a lot more policy engagement, and a lot more focus on that S in ESG. There was a time in 2020, sort of early on in the pandemic, where all eyes were on all big businesses really to see how they were protecting workers and suppliers throughout the first lockdown. I realise that a lot of what I've said so far has just been observational, so trends that we've observed over the past few years. So I wanted to come on to some quantitative research that we carried out earlier this year. So back in June, in association with Inspired Energy, we conducted our first net zero business barometer poll, taking a look at what we think, as I've mentioned, is one of the biggest changes in the sustainable business conversation. Responding to that were 161 UK-based in-house professionals, so in the roles that I've mentioned earlier, primarily sustainability, energy and carbon. 52% of these people said their organisations have set a net zero target and announced that publicly. And half of the people who said that their organisation had a deadline of 2030 or sooner, which is of course promising. However, there were some gaps between ambition and action, much like we are waiting for clarity on the government's delivery plan here in the UK, as I'm sure is the case elsewhere. The devil at this point is in the detail. So of all of our respondents, so that's all 161, those with and without public net zero targets, only 36% confirmed that their organisation has applied to the SBTI for target verification. Only about 1/5 disclose climate risk in line with the world's most common framework for doing so, so the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures. And half of those respondents have not set their targets to cut Scope 3 emissions, and this is a major one. So according to the CDP, the average large business can expect its Scope 3 emissions to be 5.5 times higher than its direct emissions. So we're not going to get to net zero or to make the transition or to make it just without engaging on Scope 3. We asked everyone responding to the poll about their challenges on the road to net zero, and unsurprisingly, one of the most commonly cited answers was cost at this moment on time. But there was also a look at policy clarity as well. There was a fairly even split between people that thought that the UK would or wouldn't meet net zero, a lot of calling for the overarching net zero strategy to come ahead of COP26. And then some of our respondents also said they don't have the in-house expertise needed. And we've seen through other studies that this is particularly pronounced with SMEs as well. So after setting the scene, I wanted to just briefly touch on business involvement at COP26 itself with a few points. So the UK government, as we've said, is really keen to showcase UK PLC at the event and showcase the opportunity economically of the green transition at this point in the COVID-19 recovery. However, businesses are not allowed to contribute to the official negotiations for obvious reasons. Agreements are meant to be ratified by world leaders and negotiators and not by big oil, big plastics or other industries. And with that in mind, the main involvement of the private sector comes in the form of sponsorship, side events and exhibitions as well. So I've listed here the principal partners for the UK's COP26 unit, and this is the highest level of sponsorship. The unit has said that they will not accept sponsorship from companies that do not have a public net zero target, with 2050 at the deadline at the very latest, and without a credible plan to back it up. And while there had been reports early on of talks with oil majors. As you can see, this sector is absent from that list. I wish I could tell you a little bit more about what events and exhibits are going on, but we're still largely awaiting the details ourselves, just because of COVID-19 uncertainties. As I mentioned, businesses are only ramping up their actions ahead of COP26, keen to show off what they are doing. So some of the things that we've been seeing businesses doing alone are setting net zero targets. And although our research found that most businesses with net zero targets don't yet have a science-based target, verification is increasing pretty rapidly. So as of yesterday, the Sunday, the SBTi had verified 899 targets, most of those being aligned with that 1.5C temperature pathway. Something that's a bit less common, but we are seeing now, is businesses publishing transition strategies. So not only having the net zero target, but outlining how they'll protect and empower communities, suppliers, and other involved parties throughout the transition. A few that spring to mind are Unilever, which put its plans to a vote, SSE, and then also more recently the Co-op Group as well. And then, as you'd expect, is all systems go on changing comms campaigns. You only have to look at the adverts in between Premier League matches, for example, at the moment, to see how much there is on, you know, electric vehicles, low carbon electricity and heat tariffs and so on. But something that's been interesting beyond that is a lot more collaboration. We've been seeing an increasing number of collaborative initiatives launching and growing, including the Race to Zero, which is the UN's official campaign. The Business Ambition for 1.5C, which feeds into that a bit, the Climate Pledge, which is co-founded by Amazon and Global Optimism, and then the World Economic Forum overseeing Mission Possible Partnership, looking at transitioning some hard-to-abate sectors to net zero, including heavy industry. We've also seen increasingly engagement with policymakers, so businesses writing to policymakers or meeting with them broadly in these coalitions or through other forums. And on the side there are just two of the stories we've covered in this field this year, but there have been a great many more. And in many instances, these have been successful. So to the one on the top there, fleet managers writing to Boris Johnson asking for the ban on new petrol and diesel car sales to be confirmed by 2030 did work. This did happen. We're now seeing asked for more clarity in terms of range of vehicles available and on infrastructure as well. And just to summarise this, all of this begs the question of, that all sounds good, but is business climate action enough? And as I'm sure the other two presentations will emphasise as well, the answer is ultimately no. So last year's UN emissions gap report stated that the world will be on track for 2.5 to 2.7 degrees of warming by 2050 on a business as usual trajectory. So that means both Paris Agreement trajectories will be breached, and that was confirmed again by the UN this week as it pushed for nations to confirm their updated Paris Agreement commitments ahead of COP26. More recently, so last week in fact, Climate Action Tracker published a new index looking at the temperature pathway of various countries, which revealed that only one nation, and that's Gambia, has plans that are actually aligned with 1.5C. The UK was deemed to be close, but not quite there because of some remaining policy gaps. So with all of this in mind, there is a need now for businesses to continue doing what I've described as part of the green recovery narrative and leverage what has been called their Scope X influence. This is a term coined by Solitaire Townsend at Futera. It means essentially not only going through a business's indirect impacts. So for example, if you are an oil and gas company, that involves the burning of the products at the end use, but it also looks at every other way in which they touch and influence all parts of society. So their marketing, lobby groups, and people that they reach indirectly as well. And as I've mentioned, there is a broad lack of transition plans, meaning that there is a lack of an intersectional approach and a real approach to the just transition. At the moment, we are broadly seeing that this is a narrative and an ambition rather than a concrete plan for a great many businesses as well. Just because the briefing on this involved ESG as well, I wanted to come on to greenwashing, which is another pressing problem that we're facing. So while a lot of businesses are taking science-based action, hiring more teams, changing their approach, For a great many businesses, it will be easier to do the talk and then do the walk. So most people in this space expect greenwashing to get worse before it gets better, even with improved science and with ESG looking like it is sort of edging out CSR a little bit. I'm not an expert on ESG and ESG criticism, so I've noted down some resources you might want to access on this. So Influence Map researches this in depth and produces regular reports on this, so they're one to watch. And then writers in this field include Robert Armstrong and Hans de Pera. But essentially, if you're looking at ESG from the point of view of investing, what is being asked now is essentially how can you be an ESG fund and include a tobacco company in that, or an oil or gas company? Can FMCG companies be ESG minded when they're producing so much plastic? Can tech companies be ESG minded when you look at human rights abuses in critical raw material supply chains and the fact that some of them are providing their software to those other sectors that we've mentioned? So this has been a pretty brief run through because it's all we have time for, but we are, shameless plug, hosting a lot of resources on these topics for free on our site at the moment. Our business guide to COP26 does what it says on the tin, really. It answers all of your FAQs about how businesses are preparing, what will happen during the 2 weeks, what's likely to happen after, and an array of other questions. So that's hosted on our website at the link there, and that is kindly sponsored by EY. As I've mentioned, it's free to access. We're also hosting a series of what we're calling COP26 primary reports, taking a look at the global state of play in regards to the original 5 themes selected by the UK's COP26 unit for the conference. There's a picture there of the cover for the Climate Adaptation and Resilience primer. The other themes are clean energy, clean transport, climate finance and nature-based solutions. And you can access all of those at that link, so ed.net/downloads. That's ed.net/downloads. And those are free to access as well. They provide a little bit more of a global and a bit more of an in-depth look than the business guide. And as the IES is doing, and they've talked about, we're in the middle of our Countdown to COP26 campaign as well. We kickstarted our festival in May with a high-level online event, but there's much more to come through to the end of October. So please do check out the tab on our website to see how you can get involved. And that programme of events for us at ED is kindly being supported by Virgin Media O2, our headline partner. That's all I have. I'm really looking forward to taking questions and diving into some of that a little bit more. And as I mentioned, the next few speakers will really hammer home at the opportunity of the net zero transition and what that means for business, the economy and workers. If you have any questions you want to put to me directly, my email is on the side there, or I'm happy to add you on LinkedIn. But for now, I should probably hand back over to Joseph, and thank you so much for letting me present first.
Thank you, Sarah. That was a great presentation. I think you really captured the context of the strategic level on which some of these businesses are operating, as well as the evolution of the approach that they're taking, which they may take in the future. I think that came across very clearly. So I'd like to hand over to our second speaker, Josh Emden. Josh, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks everyone. So yeah, my name is Josh. I'm a research fellow at the IPPR. The IPPR are the Institute for Public Policy Research. We are a progressive policy think tank, and a lot of our focus for the last 2 years has been looking at what a just transition is. And in this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on a just transition in the context of jobs and the risks and rewards therein. So I'm going to focus firstly on the rewards, then look at the risks, and then I'm going to look at the action needed by government and then the action needed by business. It's worth saying that it was really interesting to hear from Sarah about all the range of different actions that businesses are taking. It was also really interesting to hear that lack of policy came up as a kind of clear barrier from members that the EDI had surveyed. So I think that's come through really strongly in our research as well. That government policy is going to need to be a really key driver for businesses to be taking any action. But there are things that businesses can do as well. In terms of, I suppose, the overall messages from this presentation, I suppose the 4 things I want you to take away from this is, firstly, that just transition is very place-based in the context of work. the very places where jobs may be most at risk are also the areas of substantial opportunity with the right support, and obviously that right support is a crucial caveat. The other thing is that job quality is just important as job quantity. So not just going to a new job, but going to a decent paying, secure job. There's a lot the government can do to make sure that this happens, and to emphasize, it's not currently doing enough of it. Some would say any of it. And if there's no just transition, there is a risk of no transition at all. That is to say that if you do not support workers and support local communities and support homes with costs, etc., then there's a real risk that that will undermine the just transition process, because people will rightly, or understandably, I should say, be protesting against the changes that are going to happen without any support for them. That is not a reason not to do it. That is very much a reason to do more on supporting a just transition. But first, I suppose, just defining what I mean by this in the context of jobs. So what I mean when we're talking about just transition for jobs is creating new low carbon, high quality jobs, but also making sure there is universally accessible support for workers in high carbon jobs, and also new labour market entrants, so graduates or people coming from technical colleges, to access high quality, secure jobs, whether that's in an existing business, so a high carbon job transitioning to a low carbon to work, the low carbon sector at large, the green economy, if you like, or the wider economy where it's not necessarily explicitly low carbon, like IT, for example, but there is a job that would be compatible with a net zero future. So it's about helping people move into these kinds of jobs, both existing workers in high carbon jobs and new labour market entrants as well. I've just put a link there, again, a little shameless plug, which is looking at the final report of our Environmental Justice Commission, which goes into a lot of this in a lot more detail. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today will be taken from the graphs that you'll see will come from them, and then also the research as well. So for more information, please do go to that. Starting off with the rewards, though, I suppose the first thing to say is that there is a substantial job creation opportunity in the UK. We looked at direct and indirect jobs that could be created in quote unquote clean industries by 2035. You'll note that road building programs are not one of them, that circle in grey there. And what this graph shows is roughly the size of the job as is indicated by the bubble, but also how quickly some of those jobs can be created. So for example, with energy efficiency retrofitting, so insulation, loft and wall insulation, that kind of thing, those jobs can be created right away because we need them right away, and there are a large number of them. Similarly for heat pumps and for reforestation or afforestation. And then there are some longer term jobs, opportunities like hydrogen and CCS infrastructure. Lots of people are debating about the merits of hydrogen and CCS infrastructure for power, and we would very much agree with that, but there will be some potential opportunities for industry, for heavy high carbon industrial users. When we say CCS, for those that don't know, we mean carbon capture and storage technology. So first off, it's worth just saying that there are substantial opportunities to be created from moving towards the UK's net zero targets. And that is something that we should be championing first of all. The second thing to say is that these jobs can be created across the country, and there is quite a big overlap, and we'll get onto this in a second, between jobs that can be created and the same places where jobs will be at risk from potentially being in high carbon sectors. The best graph that probably illustrates this is the carbon capture and storage graph, which is in the bottom right. What you'll see there is the potential for carbon capture and storage for different industrial facilities. Again, we don't want to overemphasize that technology too much, because it's something that I think is much ballyhooed, but there is no full-scale kind of commercial carbon capture and storage in the UK yet. There's lots of sort of pilots, there's lots of small-scale things going on across the world. But it's still an interesting demonstration of the fact that there's a crossover between the potential for job creation and the potential high carbon industries across different regions. The other thing to say is that there is again a potential for decent paying jobs. So what we did in this chart, we looked at some of the jobs that are likely to be in demand in the just transition. So things like health and safety managers, electrical engineers, maintenance engineers, welders, and we kind of split this into high skilled jobs and medium skilled jobs. And what this demonstrates is that for many of those jobs, the sort of average annual salary for those are higher than the regional median salaries. So these are in effect decent paying jobs that could be a good opportunity. So it's not just the case that you're moving from one job into a worse paying one, that there is the potential for these decent paying jobs. And when I say potential, that's a really load bearing term. And I'll get into why that's so load bearing in a second. This next slide demonstrates that whilst there are the potential for many jobs, there's a potential for a good distribution of jobs across the country and decent paying jobs, there's also this risk reward narrative where you have transferable skills versus those that require upskilling or indeed reskilling. Upskilling is where you're kind of increasing your existing skills base, and reskilling is where you're retraining into a different kind of skilling entirely. So what this graph shows, this is work done by the LSE that we used in our report. And what this demonstrates is that there's a significant proportion of jobs that are, proportion of skills, I should say, that are in demand, particularly in some of the more high emitting sectors. So things like construction and manufacturing. So that's a big opportunity when you think about the jobs, the skills that people have that are going to be needed in future. And it demonstrates that it's not all doom and gloom in these kinds of sectors and for these kinds of businesses. There are a substantial number of people with skills that will be needed, but there are also a substantial number of people with skills that will need to, people that will need to reskill. And that means taking up training, and that means potentially finding either new jobs, ideally in the same company, but potentially also in different industries as well. So there's a real kind of, I suppose, risk and reward scenario here. And it's particularly acute in some of the more, some of the higher emitting sectors like construction, manufacturing, and transport as well. I'm not going to go through every single part of this table, but I suppose this is just an example of what we mean by transferable skills and some examples of those. So looking, for example, at offshore wind, there's lots of, in parts of the country where there's lots of oil and gas, there are lots of people with skills like engineering and seamanship skills that will be very much needed in offshore wind. In energy efficiency and heating, there's already a lot of gas engineers who have training of how to deliver heating systems, but there's potential kind of upskilling needs to be knowing how to develop, knowing how to install low carbon heating systems as well. And then other examples, like in the power sector, there are sort of minor reskilling needs for people that have been working in different sort of low carbon, in different kind of oil and gas and chemicals and waste sectors, moving into low carbon energy projects. As I say, for more information on this, we have a report that kind of sets out this level of detail and the different kind of specific job roles that will be in demand and will need upskilling and may need reskilling as well. I think this is just an example to demonstrate there are plenty of situations where there are real sort of transferable opportunities. But I think that there are also a number of risks as well that we really need to take account of. The first of which is that we've said that there are substantial job creation opportunities, but there's also a real risk that if you don't create those opportunities in the first place, then obviously there won't be jobs to go to. And there are real skills gaps across different industries that limit the potential to move into those newly created jobs. It slows down the creation of those jobs. And in particular, that's particularly acute for things like business services and wholesale and retail, but also for construction and manufacturing, and all of which have these relatively high carbon footprints, which means that if you're not creating new jobs that are green, then you're risking kind of trapping people in those industries. There's also a kind of distribution of at-risk jobs is a real problem. So as we said before, there are real opportunities for many kind of what you might think of as traditional industrial areas, But also it's worth saying that a lot of these industrial areas have, so this is emphasizing the point that a lot of these industrial areas have jobs which, a high proportion of which come under sort of high emitting industrial jobs. And this is just demonstrating the different parts of the country, or different local authorities where this is the case, where a high proportion of so-called industrial jobs, and what we mean by that is sort of manufacturing and construction and waste and water sectors, and a high proportion of those jobs are in greenhouse gas intensive industries. This is just, I suppose, another demonstration of this distribution, looking at a kind of a map-wide approach. So places like South Wales, the Tees Valley, the Humber, and Aberdeenshire kind of pop up as kind of key regions where some of these jobs will be most at risk. Finally, it was the question. This is where we get onto kind of job quality and the question of what kind of makes a green job good. This is a chart that just demonstrates that some of the sectors with the most opportunity for clean jobs, and also the ones that are most at risk, are also the least ethnically diverse. So this is demonstrating that, you know, our definition earlier of things being universally accessible is a real problem for these kinds of industries. But also there's a question more broadly where we haven't got a specific chart for this, but there's a question more broadly about what therefore is a good green job. Because we've seen that there are some opportunities for decent pay, but we are also concerned about the diversity of the potential for those jobs. There's also real concerns about things like health and safety when it comes to certain industries. So offshore wind, for example, it can be very dangerous to go out on a vessel. And the health and safety practices haven't quite caught up with oil and gas yet. They're on the way, but even in oil and gas, it's a dangerous industry as well. So how do we make sure that we make sure that people are being looked after? Also, how do you make sure that these jobs are secure? So, and what I mean by that is long-term, and not just focusing on massive construction projects, but also how to make sure that they are sustainable in the long term, and also making sure that they are not just sustainable, but also are relatively close to where the existing jobs were. So it's one thing to say there are loads of green jobs and they are roughly in the same places or in similar places where jobs are being lost, but how rough are we talking? Are we talking about within 10 miles, or are we talking about a significant commute for people who are going to need to be taking up these new jobs? So that's kind of an overview of some of the rewards and risks of jobs in a just transition. And now I'm going to go over kind of briefly what the action is needed by government and action is needed by business. So like I said, there's a big old report that we've done on this, which kind of sets this out in more detail. And I think there are kind of 4 key areas, and I'm going to focus on the final one. But just to go through them quickly, showing government leadership is absolutely crucial. That involves setting out long-term strategies. That involves setting out the governance structures that are needed to be able to manage a just transition. So Scotland has a Just Transition Commission. The UK as a whole doesn't have something equivalent. It has a Green Jobs Task Force, but that's not quite the same thing. It's useful that it exists, but it doesn't. It's not a kind of. It doesn't have a kind of specific policy function. Raising investment is obviously a crucial one. Again, I won't go into that in massive detail, but it is worth saying that with raising investment, you raise ambition, which gets people focused on actually creating the opportunities in the first place. So I mentioned skills gaps as a limiting factor to creating jobs, but obviously the overall investment in setting the direction of the market is a crucial one as well. Supporting businesses is crucial, so making sure that they have the information they need and supporting them to do that, and having loans and policies to encourage businesses to make those transitions. I'm happy to go into all of these in more detail in the discussion, but the main thing I wanted to, or the specific policies that I wanted to discuss were around education, training and skills, because they are probably the most focused specifically on jobs. So the main thing that we have been calling for is a blueprint for low carbon work. And what we mean by that, or rather what's included in that, is firstly a funded right to retrain. So that's a legal right to retrain as part of a just transition, and a guarantee that there will be some kind of funding or support in place for that. That there are governments, unions, workers themselves, local communities, co-develop a high quality clean jobs standard and require all of those, the standards for those jobs to be embedded in all investment plans going forward. And that's really, I think that's really crucial, because firstly, it emphasizes the importance of deliberation and the importance of engagement with people and actually with workers themselves. And also, I suppose, making sure that there's evidence sessions with workers and unions resulting in fair transition agreements. That's kind of part of the process of this consultation, is actually speaking to workers and hearing what's needed. And then also, I suppose this is something that we recommend in pretty much every report, but conducting comprehensive nationwide skills audits, making sure that we actually know where the skills are, what the demand for them is, and again, looking at which ones are transferable or not. That LSE work that we showed earlier is a very useful document, but we need more granularity, going beyond just those sectors into the actual jobs themselves. And then we also need to be setting out a specific plan for diversity and inclusion. That's the kind of, if you like, what the blueprint that's needed. But there's, in terms of some of the actions that are needed, we also we mentioned kind of the funded right to retrain. So we were recommending an additional £1.1 billion per year for training course costs. We're also looking at skills academies, and I'm running short of time, so I won't go through all of this in a huge amount of detail. But I suppose the main function of skills academies is really to provide a facilitation role to help businesses access training, but also to be accrediting, evaluating and monitoring training providers to make sure that they provide the right skills. Finally, there's a huge amount that business can be doing, but I think the point we would emphasize is obviously that government needs to be taking the lead on this. And I appreciate this session is obviously discussing about what businesses need to do, but government has to play a role to set that direction. But once the government has done this, we think that businesses need to be setting out fair transition investment plans. And what that means is that they are committing to high quality jobs for workers in future, that they have a clear plan for, if they are high carbon, how to move to low carbon jobs and work, that they, in doing so, will provide accessible information packs and guidance for workers. So what do workers actually have to expect? You know, what kind of retraining do they need to take? What kind of jobs will there be in future? So all of this to give workers enough time to prepare and plan and have the headspace to do this. To look at paid skills sabbaticals, so beyond just the kind of the training course costs that might be provided, also making sure that there's some kind of funding in place to make sure that the workers have the headspace to do this whilst to train and also get paid at the same time. That happens to an extent with the apprenticeship levy, but there's more we can do in other areas. Skills mentoring, so having older people who are approaching retirement to be mentoring younger graduates. Travel assistance, which is support, so stipends for those that are traveling further distances for new work. And then finally, and there's a really crucial one, is access to unions. So making sure that low carbon companies or high carbon companies moving to low carbon employment or low carbon production have access to unions, and so that unions can make the case to workers to make sure that they are a part of the union and part of the conversation going forward. I'll stop there. That's a bit of a whistle stop, but I'm very happy to pick up any further questions in Q&A.
Thank you, Josh, for your great insights there. I think really clear on what needs to happen to make this all possible, really clear on the potential mutual benefits that we could be able to achieve as long as we can manage those risks and ensure that these are real opportunities that can happen for people. So just a reminder to participants, please do remember to put your questions in the Q&A box so that we can field them to our speakers during the Q&A and the discussion later on. For now, our next speaker is Dmitry Zangelis. Dmitry, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joseph. I hope everyone can hear me okay. I don't have slides, but I thought I would sort of wrap up by talking about the broader economic context for a lot of this transition discussion. And I thought I'll start with a kind of rather trite but very true statement, which is that the world is changing, and it's not only changing, it's changing more rapidly than ever. And it's very clear that the 21st century is not going to look like the 20th century. I mean, most obviously, the economy of the 21st century will be low carbon, it'll be less reliant on fossil fuels, it'll be more efficient, and of course it'll be highly digitized as well. It's going to need to put much less pressure on natural resources, especially the renewable kind, things like ecosystems, forests, fisheries, etc., which, once they are depleted beyond a certain threshold, tend to kind of be prone to irreversible collapse. And it's going to mean getting a lot more out of the resources we have through a process of innovation, which increases resource productivity and also improves our demand responsiveness. And in a sense, that last point is why trying to go for reduced final consumption or degrowth is likely to be very counterproductive. It will starve the resources for the innovation we need, and it's not going to be politically tractable either. And it arguably is not economically or technologically necessary. The reason for that being that we really must not confuse material growth with value growth. They are two very different things. And the aim is to get more out of the materials we have through innovation and dematerialization. And that requires a lot more focus on innovation. I say this is going to happen as if it's sort of inevitable. Well, actually, it is. Just the sheer science of global warming tells you that it's the stock of greenhouse gases, not the flow, not the annual emissions, that cause the problem. So, if we're going to stabilize the stock, in other words, stabilize temperatures, we're going to have to get emissions down to net zero. All that matters in terms of the temperatures, how quickly we do that. We either do it, the easy way by managing that transition, or we do it the hard way by creating such a hostile climate that we deindustrialize and depopulate the planet. But we will go net zero, have no doubt. It is going to happen. And once you acknowledge that, then it makes sense to start thinking about ways to get there and some of the risks and opportunity associated with doing that. Now, of course, it's not going to be easy. As everybody knows, since the Industrial Revolution, our economies have been powered by fossil fuels. So if we're to meet our Paris targets, then at least a third of all the world's global oil reserve, about half of the gas reserves, and almost all the coal that we have is going to have to remain in the ground, or if these things are burnt, we're going to have to capture the carbon and store it. And of course, it doesn't stop there. This is going to affect all downstream infrastructures, refineries, ports, power generation, and of course, all the financial services that are invested in these sectors as well. In fact, this is going to absolutely touch every sector and everyone in the world. So it's not surprising that people then begin, given that the awesome scale of this transition, the starting point very often is to talk the language of cost. What's it going to cost for us to kind of repurpose our economy? And the answer to that question, when you do the sums properly, you do the economics properly, is surprising. And I'll say a little bit about that. And the evidence of that is that the speed of the transition in some key sectors has already caught people by surprise. And this has happened with barely any or very minimal policy effort. So it makes you think what you could do with a more ambitious policy effort. 10 years ago, when I shortly after I started in this game, talk of competitive renewables and electric vehicles would have been laughed at. These things were seen as prohibitively expensive luxuries. Of course, since then we know what's happened. The cost of solar photovoltaic has fallen by 80%. Wind, the more mature technology, by something like 40% over the last decade. This is 8-fold reductions in the cost of photovoltaic. Of course, the wind doesn't always blow, sun doesn't always shine. You need storage. Foremost amongst this is battery storage, and it turns out that lithium-ion battery costs have also fallen 8-fold over that same period. So much so that they are now cost competitive with fossil fuels, as a result of which the world invests more in renewable energy generation than it does in conventional fossil fuels and hydro and nuclear combined, which is a staggering statistic that no one would have talked about 10 years ago. And they're doing it for economic reasons. Of course, the stock of generation is still predominantly fossil fuel based, but the flow into that stock is very much renewables, so much so that in its latest report, the International Energy Agency said that renewables will overtake coal to become the largest source of electricity generation worldwide in 2025, so in the next couple of years. Yes, new coal plants are being built in some parts of the world, but fewer and fewer, as we've seen from the E3G report, and they are being built, let's be clear about this, not for commercial reasons. They're being built for political reasons, a lot to do with jobs, communities, and also business lobbies rather than cheap energy. And in the vehicle sector, of course, no serious auto manufacturers investing scarce R&D in the combustion engine anymore. So that ship has sailed. And these sectors aren't the only sectors where this is going to happen. The sheer scale, and this is the key point, the sheer scale of this transition generates these productivity enhancing network effects, these learning effects, these economies of scale in production and discovery that generate these very substantial cost reductions. They also have very large spillovers to the rest of the economy as well, and there's some interesting studies that look into that. But of course, this drives a really interesting positive feedback mechanism, because of course, when costs fall, your incentive to deploy these technologies goes up. But it's the deployment of these technologies and the economies of scale, the learning effects and all the rest of it that drive the cost reductions. So you end up with these tipping effects, which we've seen, where very rapidly, for Asian age, everyone says, no, 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 these things are too expensive. We've been talking about them for God knows how long, and they've never happened. And then suddenly, snap, you reach a tipping point, the world goes renewable, all cars become electric. Whether you give two hoots about the climate, we're going to get cheaper electricity and cheaper, better performing cars, which we should have done anyway, right? Irrespective of the climate constraint. But that's because of this dynamic. It was the climate constraint and that minimal policy effort that allows us to overcome those barriers. And there's plenty of more of those kinds of opportunities in the pipeline. Competitive positions also matter. Falling behind on policies and investments may lead to significant displacement of productive activity and jobs to other competitor countries and firms that are ahead of the curve in terms of supplying the markets of the 21st century. So, the limits of this transition tend not to be technological or economic. They're much more political, institutional, and behavioral. But of course, to get there still will require substantial capital expenditure in the form of upfront investment. It's estimated that about 800 billion a year is going to be required to decarbonize the global economy. The bulk of that obviously associated with electrical power, with buildings, with clean transport infrastructure. But by comparison, the world is expected to invest about 60 trillion on infrastructure in the decade up to 2030. So this is a manageable amount. And one of the key things to note, and this came out in a very beautiful section with a beautiful chart in the Committee on Climate Change's 6th carbon budget, for most, in fact, all sectors, before long, the operating cost reductions are going to offset the increased capex costs. It's already started with some sectors, and by 2030 or 2040, the CCC estimates that the savings will be greater than the additional investment costs. And that's a really important point. It means there's going to have to be upfront investment, but pretty soon substantial generated savings. Of course, that makes for an enhanced role for financial and capital markets, and of course this means that sensitivity to interest rates, for example, matters, and there might have to be some public support there as well. But there's a growing recognition that the risks returns are better certainly than government bonds, and better certainly than conventional investments in fossil fuel and high carbon and high resource intensive infrastructure. And of course, for this reason, it means that we're going to see cheap access and cheap finance and investment are going to increasingly depend on demonstrating that assets are not going to be stranded. They're not going to become obsolete before the end of their working lives in a carbon and resource constrained world. Outdated infrastructure, and that includes skills, as Josh was talking about, includes ideas, can very easily become devalued or stranded, and assets can very quickly become liabilities. I quite like Josh's discussion about accrediting courses for skills, training and education, and workers can eventually self-select whether they want to do a course which they think is compatible with the future economy or not. And I suspect there'll be greater demand to reskill yourself in jobs that are future-proofed relative to ones that are based on the smokestack industries of yesteryear. And the risk of stranded assets goes beyond just questions of disclosure. We talked about, the Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosure and science-based investment, but it's going to also be about taking a forward look. It's going to be about demonstrating, if you're a business, that your revenue model is resilient to and profitable in a low carbon, resource efficient economy of the 21st century. For a government, your economic strategy has also got to be resilient to that. And the way to do that is not through coming up with forecasts, which economists fail to do with any accuracy, but through rigorous stress testing, scenario testing of these rapid change scenarios. There's also, of course, it's not just risks, it's opportunities. So we're moving from cost benefit, we're moving from static optimization type forecasting to talking about risk and opportunity analysis. And a lot of the opportunities reside not just in sort of efficiency and innovation, and not just in reduced climate risk, but also tackling a bunch of things like particulate pollution, congestion, ill health, biodiversity loss, and waste, and making our cities more kind of attractive and livable, which it turns out have massive impacts on annual GDP. You know, in some cases, particularly in some of the more polluted cities of Southeast Asia, double-digit impact on annual GDP if you were to kind of make small inroads into resolving some of these issues. So the payoffs, the co-benefits from decarbonization are very, very large. So, and this drives an appreciation of the kind of opportunities from making that change. And arguably, the COVID pandemic, tragic though it's been, marks a period of dislocation and change where you can start locking in to the kinds of pathways which create durable output and resilient, future-proof jobs. And expectations are absolutely crucial in driving this. We've seen the move from the sort of Copenhagen Agreement to the Paris Accord, where you've moved from burden sharing to opportunity. It turns out that self-interest and opportunity does drive collaboration in a way that fear of future impact and having to take collective action doesn't, because it leads to free riding and a race to the bottom. If you're a mayor or a business leader or a politician and you think the kind of clean investments are a waste of money because this is all going to go away, you won't invest and you won't generate those kind of improvements that we talked about. On the other hand, if you think this is happening and it's inevitable, you will invest because you'll expect the cost of finance to go from niche to mainstream, you'd expect technology cost to fall, you'd expect new market opportunities, and the very process of investing, as I've said already, makes that a self-fulfilling prophecy. So very quickly you get that change. So it really matters what people think, and if people think that there are opportunities. We put out a paper with a bunch of authors earlier in the year, which shows that at kind of in key areas of policy making, there's been a real radical shift in expectations about the green economy, such that some of the highest growth sectors are now seen as things like clean energy infrastructure, connectivity infrastructure, building upgrades, and energy efficiency. Previously, people would have talked of a trade-off between growth and green. You either go for old-fashioned growth, or you kind of you do the feel-good stuff in sort of protecting the environment. It's now seen very clearly that the two go together. The IMF recently wrote, this is the IMF, right? It's not a bunch of kind of bivouac living tree huggers. They wrote that an additional £1 in public borrowing to invest in, and I quote, job-rich, highly productive and greener activity would generate about £2.7 in additional output. In other words, what the IMF is saying is that there's an incredible opportunity here to crowd in growth by investing in clean technologies and clean infrastructure. The just transition is going to be a key part of this, because unless you bring people on board, because the distributional consequences of this change are not evenly spread, there will be winners and losers, and the losers know exactly who they are, they know how much they're going to lose, and they will understandably try and block change. So unless you reskill and retool workers and enable them to benefit from the opportunities of the new economy, you're not going to make any progress in this transition. Again, it's not an economic story, a technological story. It's very much a political, cultural, and behavioural story that we need to address in order to overcome the barriers to a clean transition, which leads to a better economy. So to wrap up, to conclude, it's very clear that there are these massive opportunities for visionary leaders in business and government to shape the next century. There are also risks for those that don't move fast enough, the risks of stranded assets, the risks of being left behind, the risks of locking in to skills, to infrastructure, and to ideas that are not viable in the 21st century. Now, of course, the transition is going to lead to massive disruption and valuation losses across the economy. Firms and governments will need to be aware of these, but they're also going to be offset, more than offset, by the opportunities in the creation of new value. And we know now, we've seen it in cars, we've seen it in renewables, we're going to see it elsewhere, that innovation really can deliver a cleaner, quieter, safer, but also, importantly, more innovative, more efficient, and more productive economy, and that this process has already begun. And it doesn't matter that we don't know exactly which technologies will drive the 21st century, because we know how to push the innovation, and we know how to hedge against the risks associated with not pushing those technologies and not driving these profitable new opportunities. And whereas 10 years ago, that all seemed like it was sort of slightly hypothetical, now we are seeing the facts on the ground as to how quickly that can happen. And, you know, the lesson for economists like me is, you know, let's stop trying to fruitlessly forecast the future as if it's kind of God-given, and actually recognize that the future we get is the future we generate, and talk about instead about managing risks and managing opportunities and focusing on designing and building rather than forecasting that future. I will stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dmitry. I think an excellent presentation. And as we move into the Q&A section of the event, it's a reminder of that big picture of the choices that we can and which we need to make as we go forward, and the risks and opportunities that come with that, and what's going to be required for the decarbonisation of the economy. But now let's move to the Q&A section of the event. So as we bring all of the panelists back in for a moment, we've been taking your questions in the Q&A box throughout, and I'll be putting some of those questions directly to the speakers in a moment. We would love to have a few more questions, so please do use the Q&A box to give us your questions. What we're going to start with is, before we move into the bigger, broader questions that will really sort of tax our brains, a more direct, focused one, and it's going to be a question for you, Josh. An anonymous attendee says, thank you for the presentation. Recognizing that this is a topic in its own right, can the anonymous attendee ask for a brief expansion on the rationale for the environmental benefits of CCS being medium? So very quick technical question to start us off, Josh.
Yeah, sure. I guess I'm wondering almost the bend of that question as to whether it's why the technical benefits are medium rather than more than that, or like medium, but they should be less than that. But I guess I'll try and answer from I suppose our research on it, which is that carbon capture and storage can be very useful for some industries that find it difficult to decarbonize. So they might have in energy intensive industrial processes where it just because of the heat that is required in the processes, it might just be too difficult to find a low carbon alternative, and therefore capturing the carbon emissions rather than changing the actual production processes can be helpful. So that's, I suppose, why it's needed in industry. There are some people talking about it being used to kind of scale up hydrogen production, which again is a possibility, and potentially in power as well. But we absolutely would not be in favour of doing it in power, because I mean, to be honest, I think that discussion's kind of been and gone, partly because it just adds to the cost of say a gas power station tremendously, and the international market's already doing that just fine at the moment. So I think that really the main application is in industry, potentially with hydrogen. The reason why it's sort of a more limited potential is, I suppose, firstly because we've not really scaled it up at any kind of in any significant way at the moment. The infrastructure costs are quite high. We've been talking about doing it for years and years and years and years and years, and there's not really been anything that, you know, there'll be sort of proponents will point to different projects around the world where there are examples of CCS projects, but they're not anything at the kind of scale that we might need. So just the technical requirements to do it, although the technical requirements are there, the commercial proposition is just unattractive still. And also, if we were going to use it to scale up hydrogen, there are big questions around the potential for methane leakage in the process of transporting. So the reason why it's combined with hydrogen is that you crack hydrogen using industrial processes, and you know, steam methane, for more information for those that are interested, and hydrogen kind of splits into methane and hydrogen. Into methane and hydrogen, and the methane is the thing that would be stored. But in transportation, there are leaks when sort of applied with carbon capture and storage technologies, and also it would massively increase the import of natural gas, which again at the moment doesn't appear particularly attractive given international gas prices. So there's just a lot of reasons why you wouldn't necessarily go all guns blazing for carbon capture and storage, although there are still some opportunities for some industries where it's going to be important.
Thank you, Josh. I think that a useful answer, hopefully, to our anonymous attendee. And moving to our friends in the chat box for the next question, which I'm going to start by pitching to you, Sarah. Angela asks, is there going to be a change to cost-benefit analysis so that it's not limited in scope and looks at true life cycle climate impacts, which are usually much wider than what is considered by business. Angela says, if you take a project to reduce the carbon intensity of fuel you use, on its own it looks good, but the creation of that fuel has wider impact on the environment. People tend to use models that give the results they want to support their policy or scheme. With a thought to those strategic questions that you started us off with, Sarah, what do you think is your response to Angela?
I'd say that the signs are definitely there. So integrated reporting is something that I mentioned, and there actually is the Integrated Reporting Council, which will have far more stats on this than I can call to mind. But essentially, this is a growing trend, and it's where businesses combine their financial and sustainability reports. So instead of that being an add-on, like, oh, look at all the good stuff we're doing over here, but here's our business strategy and we're actually going to up production, and our EV strategy sits over here if we're a car maker, for example. They are being integrated, so that's a promising trend. And in terms of true life cycle impacts, so beyond carbon and things like that, we're based in the UK, so I can only really answer in terms of what's going on here, but the UK government is sitting on the panel that is developing the Task Force of Nature-related Disclosures, which is like for the TCFD, but for nature. So if we're looking at the trajectory that the TCFD had, it could soon be, once that framework is finalised, a case that businesses will need to disclose their nature-related risks in their supply chains. And operations as well, which could really change the conversation there. I'm not aware of any legislation at the moment that will force businesses to look at it, or a change to cost benefit analysis from that top down policy level. A lot of businesses do use full life cycle analyses, and these are improving as the tools and the consultants improve, and as businesses hire more professionals that are trained in these, and as the metrics improve. And as the data improves. So I hope that helps. Obviously, it's something we would like to see.
Thank you for that, Sarah. I think for the next question, I'm going to broaden things out a little bit. Dmitry, I'm seeing your face. Do you want to jump in there, or?
No. I think Sarah covered it very well. But I mean, it's certainly the case that there's increasing pressure for businesses to look beyond their emissions in the production process to the full kind of scope 3 of emissions, which means all the way along the supply line, all the inputs that come into the production process, the capital equipment, and then the products that they produce, and how they're used, and then how they're recycled, retrofitted, repaired, and so on. And I think, that's the next big thing we're going to see in business. It's not just going to be disclosure of emissions. It's not just going to be the forward look. It's going to be competitive pressure on your entire supply chain to disclose your environmental impact. And of course, that's going to put a lot of pressure on metrics. So one of the things we really need to look at is developing metrics, real-time metrics on the things that matter in terms of assessing the full environmental footprint of a business's performance. And for that, there is some opportunity here from the digital economy, remote censoring, digital supply lines, and all the rest of it, to provide real-time, standardized data that can be used so that businesses can select their suppliers and so on. I think that's an area that's really worth looking at, the scope for digital technologies to promote a competition in resource-efficient, low-carbon products, services, and supply lines.
Thank you for that, Dmitry. I will, I think at this point, broaden the conversation out a little bit to a sort of a bigger looking question. And it's a question that comes from me, which is picking up, it starts with a comment we got from you, Dmitry, in your presentation, which is that this needs to touch every sector. But it's something that all three of you touched upon to some extent in your presentations, is the cross-sector nature of what needs to happen and the different ways that different sectors are going to be affected. So my question is, and we'll start with you, Dmitry, just to pick up on that comment on touching every sector, but then perhaps we'll move around the panel a little bit on this one. How do we get action out of the sectors which are currently lagging? And how do we take the initiative of individual businesses, for example, which might be doing well, and how do we make those cross-sector so that we can get, moving back to the start of the event, that transformative change rather than something which is just happening for individual businesses?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's important that you get positive competition within sectors. So one of the beneficial things that's changing is because the sort of, the risk opportunity landscape is shifting, i.e., 10 years ago, just to sort of, caricature a little bit, the green stuff was seen as sort of exotic and new and risky, whereas, real value still resided in big oil. Now it's seen as kind of, well, actually big oil and fossil fuels are actually much more risky than a lot of the new stuff, which is very clearly the way the world economy is going. And that change in perception of risk is what's, driving this desire for ESG accreditation as a means to actually reduce the cost of capital, which is where you want to end up. You want that competition to kind of, certify your activities as low carbon, so you can get cheaper finance than if you're doing stuff which might render you, unviable in the future economy. So I think that changing landscape of risk is really important, so that within any one sector, you want to you want to be ahead of the competition in terms of your decarbonisation, reducing your resource footprint. Now, the important thing is actually, when you think of it like that, it's more important that you set up that kind of competition in carbon intensive sectors than it is in those sectors, some service sector kind of administrative firms where, apart from the paper they put into their photocopier, they don't have much of a carbon footprint. If their electricity is low carbon, they just think, their offices are well insulated. And so that means not divesting from oil companies, not divesting from steel and cement and plastics, but actually making sure you stay in those markets, but you provide a very clear incentive for those key transition sectors to decarbonize. Because let's face it, we're still going to use fossil fuels for a few decades yet. We're still going to use cement, steel, and all the rest of it. And if we don't help those businesses in those sectors to transition rapidly, you're not going to be able to meet your carbon targets. Indeed, they're the most important sectors, because they're the ones that we need to get from here, which is high emissions, to here, which is zero emissions. So focusing on disclosure and stress testing forward scenarios for those key high carbon sectors, I think is going to be really, really important. And we cannot turn a blind eye to high carbon sectors, because if we don't engender a positive competition and we just allow those emissions to offshore to countries with lower wages and more relaxed carbon policies and regulations, we're not going to solve our climate problem.
Okay, thank you, Dmitry. And Josh, you talked a lot about different sectors and where the challenges will be and where there are risks. Do you want to comment on this at all? Do you agree with what Dmitry said?
Yeah, absolutely, and it's particularly about that last point about offshoring. I think that there's a risk. There's a risk that you if you ignore those sectors and you offshore the emissions, and you in doing so also offshore the jobs as well. So I think that it's a massive area of concern for us. I think that I suppose the solution to that, I think we would suggest is first and foremost the government needs to set the direction and actually needs to be engaging with these sectors. So in the past there have been sort of sector deals that the government's been arranging with different sectors. I suppose the problem, in a way, that's good, because it sets out a clear plan of what's expected for that sector, and then it's sort of there's kind of agreements of what the sector will and won't do to meet different kind of carbon targets. But in other respects, it's very much a kind of piecemeal approach. It's a bit of a kind of pick and choose approach as well. So, often the sector deals involve sort of being written by those kind of by the industries themselves, which can be useful for specifying the direction, but less useful from a sort of ambition perspective and kind of actually meeting targets. But also, it's not only is it piecemeal, but it's also, as a result of it being piecemeal, it also means that there are some sectors that just kind of really should have a kind of deal in place, or a kind of clear sort of sector in place, but don't. So things like the steel sector has been asking for sort of deals for a long time, and it hasn't got one. The oil and gas sector does now have some kind of transition deal, but it's not really rigorous enough at all, and it kind of makes very little consideration for workers themselves. So I think that I'm not suggesting that's a a model that we have to return to, but government's kind of setting the direction in the first place is crucial. And then I think as part of that, which is kind of to try and limit this kind of offshoring risk, is to make sure that you're investing in domestic supply chains as well. And that's kind of when I made the point about raising investment, that's going to be a crucial part of it is investing in sort of low carbon domestic supply chains for not just kind of, you know, when I'm talking about the job opportunities, I'm not just talking about jobs in offshore wind or jobs in low carbon technology. I'm talking about the opportunities for some of those high carbon industries to move into low carbon production, whether that's, you know, for example, with steel, whether that's kind of moving into electric arc furnaces, which is difficult for some, you know, difficult for some, easier for others, and developing kind of new kind of polymers and that kind of thing in chemicals and sort of petrochemicals industries that are kind of less carbon intensive. But I think that whatever the actual kind of solution is, having that investment in the UK is going to be really important to make sure that the jobs that are, if you like, that they're already there, we're creating jobs, kind of low carbon industrial job equivalents to transition towards. And obviously our think tank is quite UK focused, so that's kind of where I'm coming from, but it also is a useful blueprint that can be applied to other countries as well. And it's worth saying that this is something that other countries like Germany and France are already doing. They're already kind of rolling out a huge amount of investment in their own kind of manufacturing supply chains. So yes, I suppose those are just some sort of thoughts of how you might go about doing it. But I think the main point is that it has to kind of come from government first and foremost.
Well, thank you, Josh. And I'm going to bring it to you, Sarah, now to get your perspective on this. But I'm particularly interested in your perspective on this question of government versus business in terms of the first step. Is there something that these leading ambitious businesses can be doing while we wait for government investment to turn up? And can that actually have real consequences for the big picture across sectors?
So this is something we get asked a lot, and something that I asked a lot in my first few weeks as a reporter. And I think people who have different views on how the circle or the loop works and who moves first. But inevitably national policy can be quite slow just in terms of how big it is. So some businesses will always be more agile and move faster. We're also seeing more cities and regions increasingly moving faster, which puts the onus on businesses operating within them. So most UK councils now have a climate emergency declaration and a net zero plan to back that up, that's pre-2050. So obviously that will affect businesses that operate within them. So the amount of, for example, clean air zones is kind of reaching a critical mass for people that are doing last mile deliveries in cities. So that would push a lot of businesses. But in terms of your question, as I've seen in my presentation, a lot of businesses are going faster than policy, but it still seems to be the exception rather than the rule. So you look at some of the businesses that are the COP26 principal partners that are doing this, like, yes, you've got your Microsofts, your Unilevers, your Sky, your Sainsbury's. In the UK, it has been helped by the fact that we do have a legally binding net zero target, so a lot of action has been forthcoming from businesses as a result of that, but equally a lot of them are moving faster because, as we've seen from the IPCC report, 2050 needs to be the absolute cutoff rather than the ambition that a lot of businesses will be going for. The other two have spoken about how this is particularly important if you can transition right now, if you are an office or more service-based. Obviously, with a combination of things like the technologies and the political will, it can be a lot harder for these hard-to-abate sectors that we've spoken of, like steel. So this is a really convoluted way of saying that I'd agree with Josh in that policy is ultimately needed to definitely bring the laggards up to date. And I must admit, when you asked the question, I thought you meant of like a laggard in its respective sector rather than certain sectors being behind on this. So in that case, policy can really help. Also that targeted sector specific stuff that we really need now after the top line targets. As Josh has mentioned, there are some sectors that are just without a deal that should really have one. As far as I know, offshore wind is the only renewable energy sector in the UK with a deal. Obviously, you have to bear in mind that there's been COVID, but the approach is, as he said, piecemeal.
Thank you, Sarah, for that. We're just going to move to one final quick question from the chat box, from the Q&A box rather. which is from Brady for Dmitry. Can you say more, and ideally very quickly if you can, Dmitry, about the importance of competitive position between countries in these transitions? Dmitry, you're muted.
Rookie error. There's two elements to this story. One is availing yourself of the opportunities of a more efficient, productive and innovative world, and that's a kind of an absolute gain that's available to all countries that invest in new technologies, and that includes poorer countries who can leapfrog legacy infrastructure in the same way that they did with mobile telephony, with things like distributed energy. And the second bit is not the absolute gain, it's the relative gain. If this is the way the world's going to go, and if these are going to be the fastest growing markets, and if policies are going to become more hostile to emissions and extensive resource use, and if the new technologies are going to undercut the old, then it pays to get ahead of your competitors. And there's a rich stream of evidence that shows that if you can build knowledge clusters, jobs, industries and supply lines in the economies of tomorrow, and you get there early, you can lock in that advantage for good. Whereas if you delay and other countries build those knowledge clusters and supply lines, it's very difficult to then catch up. So the competitiveness story, whereas it was previously seen as one of just as the shift from cost to opportunity in an absolute sense has changed. There's been a shift in the competitiveness story from one which is, oh, you're saddling our businesses with all these climate policies, to one where we are increasingly seeing the business lobby saying to government, look, we're being left behind by an absence of clear policies. And if you don't provide us with clear climate policies, this is to the competitive disadvantage of the UK or whatever country happens to be pushing that way. And I think that change is going to have a big impact on the politics of this. But those countries that move slowly will be left behind and in an inevitable transition.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm afraid at this point we've run out of time for questions and we need to begin wrapping up the event. So thank you for all of your questions. I think we've managed to cover some really interesting topics throughout the discussion. But I'd like to hand over to each of the panelists to give a quick closing remark in 1 or 2 sentences. What's your final thought for this evening? And Sarah, let's start with you.
Thank you, just put me on the spot there. I guess given the topic that we've got, I guess my takeaway would be that it is now time to turn overarching commitments into actual plans on the ground for now, like the time has really come. And also we've talked a lot about how this can be framed, and there's a lot that I've mentioned about risk disclosures and risks about getting left behind and stranded assets. But I think it's equally important to emphasise the opportunities. I think the IPPR report and presentation had a lot of information on that, but there's several other similar reports. So I'd say that it's time to start seeing this in a positive light as well as a risk, to avoid doomism.
Thank you for that, Sarah. Josh, what's your final thought?
Yeah, that's, I suppose, tricky to, I suppose you're asking us to summarize in 2 sentences about 170 pages of research. But yeah, I guess I think if there is one, I think it's just reiterating that if you don't have a fair transition where you consider workers, and also, I mean, we're talking about workers today specifically, and we're talking about jobs, and that's kind of what I was asked to talk about. But obviously, a just transition applies on an international basis between countries. It applies for the distribution of costs for families and for homes. So it's not just about workers, it's about everyone, it's about including everyone. But if you don't have that just transition, then you won't have a kind of transition that you want at all. The example that's often used is the Gilets jaunes as an example of kind of government policy that didn't really speak to people about the changes that were made to fuel prices. And if you don't do that with workers, just as much as if you don't do it with people in the context of them being consumers, then you won't have any kind of fair transition, and it will hold back policy development to actually meet targets. And it will hold back businesses, because businesses, yes, I agree with Sarah, they some of them do go beyond government, but actually they're only going beyond government because government isn't doing enough. So I think that's those are the key takeaways.
Amazing, Josh, thank you. Dmitry, over to you for your final thought.
Yeah, I'll follow up from Josh there. A lot of the barriers, mostly political and behavioral barriers, often are justifiably to do with the distribution of consequences from change, and that's why the just transition is so important, are increasingly going to flip in the opposite direction. Where they were barriers, they're going to become drivers of change. And that's precisely because of what Sarah just talked about, which is, you know, the movement from thinking of this in terms of pain and burden sharing to thinking of this in terms of gain and opportunity. We've got plenty of evidence to show that the cost of the transition will be zero. In fact, it will generate benefits. But the really nice part of this story is that the more people that actually believe that, the more likely that's going to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And suddenly you end up with a world that's been completely transitioned and is low carbon and is innovative and is prosperous, and it happens much sooner than you think. There's a very nice paper from INET in Oxford this week that made that case very, very strongly. But the tragedy is that that's not going to happen without action. And the fact that we could do this and have this kind of this amazing future, but we're not grasping that opportunity and that we're wasting time, I think is why my optimism is conditional rather than absolute. Because if we carry on not addressing the cultural, political and institutional issues, we will waste this opportunity, because for every year that we wait, every month, every week, the costs are going to be higher and the climate risks are going to be that much more existential.
Well, thank you, Dmitry, and thank you again to all of our panelists for what I think has been a really fascinating and engaging event, and for those 3 final thoughts that really tie everything together. I'd also like to thank everyone who attended today and asked questions, as well as the IES team who've been handling the tech behind the scenes to give us a more or less seamless experience and dealing with our technical difficulties really well today. If you're interested in the work of the Institution of Environmental Sciences, you can look forward to the following, which is coming up soon. Ahead of COP26, we've been using our platform to bring together networks, organisations and experts from across the sector and the environmental profession. We're hoping to increase awareness in policy communities of key discussions like the one today, and consensuses from the perspective of environmental science to support evidence-led action. Our next event in that series, this series in fact, will be looking at the Ocean Climate Nexus and how we can support climate ambitions through a sustainable blue economy. That's going to be on Friday the 15th of October 2021. You can sign up right now. It's going to be starting at midday, just like today's webinar, and we've got another great lineup of speakers who will be telling us all about the blue economy, the UN Ocean Decade, and how it all links to climate change. You can find out more information about our work on climate change on our website. That work has been organised across 6 themes: sustainability, transformation, adaptation, green society, economy, and solutions. And as we begin to move towards the end of that economy stage, we'll soon be bringing together all the activity which we've done this year to create a final piece of work ahead of COP26. If you're an IES member, or you have expertise when it comes to climate change, and you'd like to get involved in our work to find solutions to the climate crisis, you can get in touch with the team and we'll give you all the details on the expert discussions which we're currently putting together. And if you think you have a good idea for a webinar, or you're interested in environmental science and you want to collaborate, please do get in touch. We're very keen to amplify the collective voices of the environmental profession and the environmental sector ahead of and during COP26. For now, though, that's all from us. So a massive thank you again to all of our speakers, and thank you all for attending, and we'll see you again soon.